Greetings, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Fire Right Now, where we use the power of the internet to engage experts and advocates on issues of critical importance for racial justice right now. And tonight's topic, race, the Farm Bill and beyond. What's next? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sara Kaplan. I'm the Executive Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center here at American University, and I'm lucky enough to be able to work with a variety of folks across campus holding events like this. The Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center is a hub for the research and practice of racial justice and intersectional liberation. We bring together scholars, educators, community-based change makers, policy advocates, and cultural workers in sustainable and equitable collaborations for change. Together, we create research and knowledge and forge shared tools and resources for social change. And I will say that while we believe that racial justice is an imperative goal in all areas of contemporary life, we focus our work in 4 initiative areas: race, policing, and incarceration, reproductive justice, educational access and equity, and tonight's event's theme, climate, land, and environmental justice. And like tonight's event, we are especially interested in topics that demonstrate the connections across these 4 areas. So, for those of you who have been following us on Instagram or tuning into the recordings on YouTube or just following us over the last few years, you'll know that while this is our first Fire Right Now live panel, it's actually the culmination of a summer of live streams that we've been calling Farm Bill Summer to ensure that the ongoing and much delayed reauthorization of the omnibus legislation that is known as the U.S. Farm Bill is actually addressing how we can ensure racial justice, access, and equity, and that these issues do not fall off the table in this long delayed reauthorization cycle. And for those of you who are not Farm Bill experts like me, you should know that the Farm Bill actually was due for reauthorization in 2023. The last Farm Bill was authorized in 2018. We are now operating on an extension that is due to expire at the end of this month. And as much as we'd like to imagine that extensions can go on ad infinitum, not only are we approaching the shift in the presidential office potentially, well, definitely, and the question is only in which ways, and the end of this Congress's session, with only a lame duck session left soon, but we're also looking at a situation that is increasingly dire, in which the target amounts and what was set in the 2018 Farm Bill are being extended without any recognition of inflation and changing conditions, making it harder and harder for landowners, farmers, foresters, and ranchers to survive. So, that said, the work that we have been doing over this summer is part of a broad national movement. And you'll have noticed on this screen that some of our partners' policy recommendations and demands for the Farm Bill have been streaming behind us. Those are simply the demands from the organizations that have been part of our Farm Bill Summer. But if you look at our Farm Bill toolkit, pointing the Farm Bill toward racial justice, you'll see, or on our website, farmbillfairness.org, you will see that there are any number of organizations who have been creating marker bills, policy recommendations, and demands to try to shift this Farm Bill toward greater equity and particularly toward greater racial justice. In fact, our own work is the culmination of more than 18 months of work here at AU, and longer for some of us, on pointing the Farm Bill toward racial justice. Not only did we sponsor a summit, the Farm Bill Summit, pointing the Farm Bill toward racial justice, in April and early May of 2023, with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, the Berkeley Food Institute, and the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity here at American University. We brought together farmers, landowners, foresters, policy advocates, and others to talk about how we might work through every title of the Farm Bill to increase its possibility for racial and social equity. and then led a briefing on Capitol Hill after that. But we also worked with the Federation and the assistance of April Love and the Policy Institute at Alcorn State to put out our Farm Bill Toolkit, which takes folks through how they can better understand and engage with the many ins and outs of Farm Bill policy, and to understand what is crucial to our model of thinking about agricultural policy in general and the Farm Bill in particular. That climate justice equals racial justice, equals food justice, equals reproductive justice, equals farm justice. The goals of this work, both now and before, are to recognize how good food, agricultural, and climate policy requires thinking about racial justice. And also, for those of us like me who are new to thinking about agricultural policy as a race issue, to understand why racial justice and work toward greater racial freedom, autonomy, and self-determination requires thinking about rural and agricultural policy, not only for the black and brown farmers who are still working right now on our land, but because, as we know, this nation was built on the farm-based labor of black, brown, and indigenous folks. So, our goal right now is not simply to prevent slipping backward with the forms of Farm Bill proposals that we currently see coming out of the House Agricultural Committee, which would drag back many of the progress areas that have been created in the last few farm bills in areas of racial justice, opportunities for the poor to have access to food, opportunities for farm workers to have even some level of representation in USDA, etc. But our goal is also to imagine a future where we aren't currently constantly reacting, farm bill to farm bill, reauthorization to reauthorization, and where we're beginning to build out of this long-standing grassroots movement an ongoing campaign that brings scholars together with experts on the ground, farmers, policy advocates, organizers, even extension workers, to think about rural and agricultural policy as a crucial site for racial justice work, to continue to build and strengthen the tools, resources, and coalitions for ongoing work that connects racial, farm, and environmental and climate justice. So we've been really lucky that we are part of this national movement and that we've garnered, even as new as we are at the table, some support from funders and sponsors, from partners and coordinators, from experts and advocates to help us on our way. Our sponsors include the College of Arts and Sciences, where ARPC is located, and the Provost's Office for Research and Innovation, where we receive most of our research funding. But we are especially grateful to the program on environmental and energy law at Washington College of Law, who were kind enough to help us get this incredible space for this event, the AV, etc. And also for the Platform for Agriculture and Climate Transformation, which provided the bulk of the funding for this summer series and today's live panel. I also want to just mention that this event is, as I said, the culmination of a 6-part series, counting this, and that we've had a number of incredible speakers who spent time with me, educating me and helping me learn more about Farm Bill policy, racial justice, and agricultural policy, and sharing it with all of you, including Dr. Garrett Grady Lovelace, the Provost Associate Professor of Environment, Development, and Health at American University, Dr. Jasmine R. Jackson of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, Seneca Edwards Heron of Friedman Ayers Foundation, Tandalyn Daniels and Freddie Davis III from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, and Millie Trevino Sauceda of Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. It's been an incredible set of conversations. If you haven't gotten to hear them, I encourage you to go back and listen to them on our YouTube channel or on our Instagram Reels, and I'd like to take just a second and give a fast clap for those amazing speakers. And I also, because if you're thinking about labor, and you always have to think about the people whose labor makes everything possible, so I do want to take a second and just do the shout out to the ARPC staff, Nalani Love Harris, Justine Williams, and Lily Wong, who organized this, reel us in, keep my feet on the ground when I want to make it bigger and more unfeasible. And the Peel Program Coordinator, Ingrid Lessman, PAC's incredible Katie Hansen and Natalie Carr, who ushered us through the funding process and have supported us at every step. And our videographers today who are streaming, to those of you on Instagram and YouTube right this minute, Lee Green and Sara King. Thank you all. Also, shout outs to those of you in the remote audience. I know we have folks all over the country who are listening in. If something goes wrong, please let us know. If you need something, please let us know. And I wanted to share with those of you who are not in the room that we have a packed house today, that we have a number of folks. Not only do we have faculty from the law school and from main campus here at AU, but we have Dr. Garrett Grady Lovelace, SIS 620 class here, who are doing work on political ecology and farms. We have alums of the practicum that Dr. Grady Lovelace ran in 2023, and those alums actually were the major part of the everyday labor that made the Farm Bill Summit happen. They are actually Farm Bill experts, and their information and research were integral to putting together our toolkit. We have undergraduate students, including students from Students for Justice in Palestine, where for those of you who are continue to be interested in this event, I strongly encourage you. There's an event in SIS on the 26th that is thinking about the ecology of the genocide, thinking about questions of famine, food access, and ecocide in broader senses. So, welcome to all of you. And I want to now just take a moment and say that we're going to have a bit of a tight night tonight. We have a lot we want to talk about, and we're hoping to get through it all, but I promise we will leave opportunities for questions, both for those in the room and those in the audience. And this is pretty much the most you will hear me talk. I am here to learn as much as you are. So, my goal right now is to introduce our amazing panelists in alphabetical order, and then from there, to really ask a couple of questions for them to think about and answer. We've had a number of conversations this summer. I was lucky enough to learn from them individually and collectively, and the framework for this conversation comes out of those discussions. So I'll ask them to weigh in on these questions to help us think both about this current moment of Farm Bill 2023/2024/probably 2025, and also the future of racial justice-focused work at the intersections of farm policy, food policy, land policy, and climate policy. So with no further ado, I will sit down now while I introduce our speakers. Dr. Dãnia Davy, from Land and Liberation, LLC, a consultancy promoting liberatory relationships between humans, natural and financial resources, and land. This summer, Dãnia Davy taught Examining Food System Equity Through Critical Race Theory at Vermont Law School. She has served as the Senior Policy Advisor for the U.S. Southeast Region at Oxfam and the Director of Land Retention and Advocacy at the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. And just to pause there, where Dãnia was one of the visionaries, leaders, and primary organizers for our Farm Bill Summit in spring 2023, and managed to get over 50 farmers from the Federation to participate with their brilliant advice and advocacy at every stage of the summit. Dãnia started her legal career as Skadden Fellow at the Land Loss Prevention Project. She earned her JD at the University of Virginia School of Law and her AB in Africana Studies and Community Health at Brown University. She currently serves on the boards of the Farmers Legal Action Group, the Southern Rural Development Center, and A Place Matters Incorporated. Dãnia Davy, everyone. Next, I'd like to introduce David Howard from National Young Farmers Coalition. David leads the coalition's policy development work in alignment with the Young Farmers Strategic Plan, and specifically in service of the coalition's commitment to win bold policy change and secure material benefit for young and Black, Indigenous, and other farmers of color. In the 10 years prior to joining Young Farmers, David served in various roles for former Iowa Senator Tom Harkin and as a presidential appointee to the U.S. Department of Agriculture during the Obama administration. He grew up in Portland, Oregon, and in the small town of Marble Rock, Iowa. He holds a BA in political science from the University of Northern Iowa. And last but not least, April Love from the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Center at Alcorn State University. April Love joined Alcorn State University in August 2020 as a policy analyst with the SDFR Policy Research Center and leads the center in developing equity-centered policy recommendations to ensure that farmers of color are prioritized in legislation and programming. Prior to joining the Policy Center, April served as a law clerk for the Office of the Louisiana Attorney General, the Louisiana State Senate, and the Louisiana House of Representatives. She has a Bachelor of Arts in English from Tougaloo College, a Master of Arts in Curriculum and Instruction from the University of Mississippi, and a Juris Doctor from Southern University Law Center with certificates in public law and tax law. And thank you all for coming here. Let's jump right into this. So, you all just heard me use the tagline. It's been our tagline for the summit, the toolkit, our Fire Right Now Farm Bill Summer Series. Climate justice equals racial justice equals food justice equals reproductive justice equals farm justice. And I say it again not because you all don't know this, but because y'all might want to hear it again out there. We've been talking about this as a way to understand how agricultural policy and justice are central to racial, economic, and climate justice. But what I want to hear from each of you is how you understand this and how the Farm Bill in particular and ag policy more generally are interconnected with other crucial aspects of racial and social justice. And then how do we make these connections more visible, especially for folks who say, might be really active in racial justice movements but have never thought about farms, have never thought about rural or agricultural policy, or for folks who've been doing farm work for years and farm policy for years but have never thought about why it matters to think about racial justice in these areas. So I'm going to actually go in this order. Dãnia, will you go first on this one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me here. It's so great to see all these students in here because I'm really excited about this topic, but I hope that students will get more engaged in these conversations because you all, the excitement you all have about these intersections, I feel like even myself as a biracial person, as a new American person, has gotten access to all this terminology around climate justice, around liberation, and what that looks like for our family over in Palestine. And so kudos to you all for your engagement. To me, I think the Farm Bill and the predecessors of the Farm Bill, all of the land and agricultural policies that this country has had, have really kind of set the stage for the ways in which our agricultural institutions kind of undermine and the colonization process through the ways that we use American agricultural products on the markets. I'm originally from the island of Jamaica, and I think that if you look at what has happened in the past 40, 45 years with U.S. agricultural policy, you'll see that all of the consolidation and aggregation and the move away from the origins of the Farm Bill, because if you think about what was happening as the precursor to the Farm Bill, America was really a developing country thinking about how do we get the West settled in ways that are competitive to make our agricultural production competitive on the global market. So the question of our agricultural power has always been a global issue. It's always been an intersectional issue. And the ways in which we will dump goods onto other markets affect prices. And originally, these supports were put in place around the Farm Bill for small farms. Small farms are ecologically sound. They're sustainable. Those are the ways in which this country was, originally designing these agricultural policies so that folks and their families could be off-grid, what the young people would call off-grid now, right? And so I'm really excited to think about the history of the Farm Bill as a racial and economic justice issue, because now that we see that programs around racial equity are being rolled back and scaled back, with folks saying things like, if I was a black farmer, a white cis-het male saying if I was a black farmer, I'd get access to all these resources. Well, if you look at the real numbers coming out of the commodities, the price supports, the crop insurance, all of the ways in which white farms have been stabilized to destabilize our global agricultural competitors, that's part and parcel of why our ecological and environmental degradation is so terrible, because transporting that much food abroad has an ecological environmental impact, right? And then it also has an immigration impact, where folks in these countries that have agrarian lifestyles have to come here, and when they come here, their labor is exploited, and then again, you know, we're being told in our national presidential debate that immigrants like me are eating people's dogs and cats. And my cat looked at me and was like, what the? And so I really think that there's no way for me to look at the Farm Bill and our agricultural policies in isolation. It's very much integrated. It's the second largest piece of domestic legislation. It's actually, the defense bill is the only one that's larger, and that is explicitly looking external to this US. The Farm Bill is the only opportunity that we have to really think about that many resources to unite across the movements, to have a conversation around liberation. And what that looks like here will have ramifications for empowering those all around the world.
Amazing. Thank you. I didn't know that either. Look at us. April, would you like to go next?
Sure. Am I? Let's see. Okay. Can you all hear me? All right. I'm bad with the technology. I find this to be such an interesting question, and I'm going to embarrass myself for a second, but I have no problem doing that. I tell people all the time, and Dãnia has told me to stop telling people this. I just learned about agriculture 4 years ago when I came to the policy center. I have no idea how I got my job. You know, but like you, had no knowledge of what a farm bill was, had never heard of it before, had no knowledge of agricultural policy, no knowledge of agricultural law. My background prior to that had been education policy and law, a little bit of criminal justice reform, and so those were my passion projects, you know, looking at what was going on in Angola, looking at what was going on in the prison systems, maybe a little bit of food desert talk here and there. And it wasn't until I came on at the Policy Center and I was asked to read the 2014 and 2018 Farm Bill that I was like, I need to find a new job. After meeting people like Dãnia and some other people and then walking me through it, I began to see the connection between those topics I had been working on before when I was in law school, when I was in undergrad, and the topics that I was being asked to work on now. As Dãnia mentioned, the Farm Bill is huge. It's 12 titles, 12 very different and distinct titles, including a miscellaneous title that includes whatever else needs to go in there. So you have trade in there, you have nutrition in there, which includes SNAP, which includes WIC, you know, commodities, conservation, which is environmental issues. There's so many things in that Farm Bill. And as somebody who has transitioned into working with agriculture policy and out of working with what is traditionally seen as the cool things to work with when you do social justice and civil rights work, it has been a battle getting my friends and those that I talk to kind of take the agricultural racial issues serious. But agriculture truly does touch everything. I mentioned earlier, I went to law school in Louisiana. We were always talking about Angola. Angola has a large farm that the prisoners, those who are in prison, have to work on. That's a labor issue. Where do you think the stuff that they're farming is going to? You know, like that is an issue that's prison reform, criminal justice reform, and it's agriculture as well. You think about why is crime even happening in the quote-unquote inner cities? You know, oh, they're doing all this robbing, stealing, killing, and all this kind of stuff. It's a food desert. It's an economic issue. It's lack of jobs, things of that nature. But how else are you supposed to get food? Sometimes you have to do what you have to do. So that's criminal justice reform again, and it can touch agriculture because within agriculture is nutrition. SNAP. The big holdup with the Farm Bill right now is SNAP. They're arguing back and forth about whether money should be cut within SNAP. And so if there is money cut to SNAP, less people have access to SNAP. And so now what's gonna happen when you need to feed your child, or you need to feed yourself, or you are a child trying to feed yourself, as we see so often? Stuff's gonna happen because you have to do what you have to do. And so I really enjoy being able to talk to people and draw these connections with people to what is going on within agriculture and how it relates racially and culturally to things. You know, I was up here last week for the Congressional Black Caucus Annual Legislative Conference. Not a lot of talking going on about agriculture, but anytime I would meet someone, I met somebody and they were reading a book on gun violence. I said, did you know that urban agriculture has been shown to reduce crime in certain communities? He's like, I didn't know that. Are you serious? I was like, yeah. I met somebody who was talking about labor issues. I said, did you know that within agriculture and those who work on farms, there is a higher chance of being trafficked or being sexually assaulted? Boom. Now they're like, hold on, I need to go look more into this whole agriculture thing because what is going on here? And then I tell them that there's not any type of labor-related anything in the Farm Bill, no labor protections, which is a whole other ball game. But I think that is why, you know, for those of us up here in like American University and the work that they're doing is just so important, because this center is really bridging the gap between these different topic areas: reproductive justice, climate, criminal justice reform, you know, with this traditional conservative area called agriculture that nobody's thinking about ever. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to pass it on to David in a second, but I do want to say, for those of you who are on YouTube and we're struggling, the YouTube is up and working, so if you prefer YouTube to Instagram, feel free to hop back on over there. And also, I want to congratulate you all. You're doing so good with your time. Okay.
We see you over there in the corner.
Right before I start.
But no pressure, no pressure, David. Okay, so David, yeah, take your take on this.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I think, you know, when I was thinking about this statement of climate justice equals racial justice equals food justice equals reproductive justice equals farm justice, like this looks very familiar to me, because at Young Farmers Coalition we talk about how farmers experience the challenges they're confronted with in an unsiloed way. They're not experiencing, you know, conservation challenges and land access challenges and credit and healthcare and, you know, all the things, right, in different silos. They're experiencing them all at once, right? And so we need to look at solutions that really contemplate that. So I really like the way this is framed, and I think, you know, in policy, we're doing a disservice to the work if we don't recognize the interconnectedness of these issues. So I also want to say, I think a just farm future is possible. I think a more just agricultural future is possible. It feels impossible sometimes, often, but it is not impossible. It is possible. We have to look to the experience that farmers are having. We have to understand that, you know, and we have to develop policy that thinks about all of these interconnected areas. And when we're working on, you know, conservation policy, we have to be thinking about land access. We have to be thinking about credit and marketing. We have to be thinking about the downstream impacts of what's going to happen on that farm. What about that farmer's financial future? How are they going to retire? You know, so there's all of these different issues. And if you're a farmer, you're experiencing all the challenges of being in America, struggling to make it work, and you're experiencing all the challenges of farming, right? So any policy that Congress or the administration is considering that impacts the middle class or impacts us in a socioeconomic way is relevant to farmers. And so as an organization, as an ecosystem of advocates who want to improve the experience of farmers, we need to be thinking about those connections. Also, nothing happens in a vacuum, right? And there's no absolutes other than the saying that there's no absolutes. I believe that is absolute. But yeah, again, we do a disservice if we don't observe those connections, and if we don't really intentionally go after understanding things deeply and working with advocates who, you know, each of us understand a different piece. You're getting a different take from each of us. I certainly don't know everything, but if we work together, right, we can address these issues. How many do I have?
Great, you've got another minute plus.
Well, I guess maybe I'll get into a little bit of the next question, which is that I really don't think that we have enough power as an ecosystem, right? And not only is it possible to get to where we want to go, but not with the current power that we hold as a community of advocates, as an ecosystem. And so I think, you know, thinking about policy development, we also have to think about the connections in terms of how that policy development, policy change happens. Not only the connections between how people are experiencing these issues and how those issues are discussed in Congress and the administration, the state government, local government, and in nonprofits across the country, but also, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Well, no, I think this is actually a great segue to exactly where we were going, because this was.
Sorry, the process,
Yeah, the
that's what I was
process.
saying. The connections between the process, right? Like, this doesn't just come out of nowhere. There's, you know, foundation support. All of these organizations are working so hard to do so much to solve big problems, right? And you have to think about the processes that are required in order to get there, right? All of the work that goes into a farm bill, you know, we need to think about the interconnectedness of those processes and how each of those steps is being resourced and ensuring that there's an equitable, intersectional, collaborative approach at each step, right? And most importantly, at the beginning, right? It's not enough to put an idea out there and, you know, have it mostly baked and then bring everyone into the conversation at the back end. You're not going to get to that just future by doing policy advocacy in that way. I have done advocacy in that way. I've evolved over time. You know, I think that is sort of the traditional approach. Is, you know, crafting something in a small room and then sharing it with a larger room and hoping that it works, right? And I think we need to move past that.
I think that is exactly one of the things that we've all been talking about. I've talked about it, I think, with each of you individually. We've talked about it collectively. It's one of the conversations we were having with the folks at PACT this summer, and even with some of our other allies and sponsors like at Regenerative Agriculture Fund and others, is that there is this incredible need to build these bridges and create the connections between the movements, the regions, the issues in the political spheres that are often considered separate, that are, you know, seen as siloed, and that, you know, often can only come to each other when it's already at the point of sort of a territorialism or a kind of anxiety or a kind of, you know, struggling over knowledge or resources. And so what I love about this panel, and part of the reason y'all are up here, just to be honest, is because each of you are so committed to thinking about the work of bridging and connecting. And that's what we're really interested in, and we'll talk more about that at the end. But what are one or two areas where each of you think that strengthening and highlighting connections is super important? I'm going to go to April first, because the way you've talked about juridical and legislative stuff is so exciting to me.
So I will say that this is something that I started thinking about in law school, but that it has recently become more realistic to me with the current legal landscape as it pertains to racial equity and anything racially motivated. When I was in law school, I took Con Law 2, favorite class, with Professor Bell, hardest professor in the law center. That's what people said. Still went ahead and took her. But one of the things that stuck with me from her class was where she was going through what was going on in Angola, because she was a huge Angola advocate, big advocate for the ending of non-unanimous juries in Louisiana. She worked very hard on that. But the one thing that she highlighted with the work on the non-unanimous juries in Louisiana was the fact that people tried to keep everything so separate. So the policy people are doing what the policy people are doing. The lawyers are doing what the lawyers are doing. And the lawyers don't want to work with the policy people to put everything together to have like a campaign or a plan of action. But it was only once that actually happened that that they were actually able to get rid of the non-unanimous juries in Louisiana. And so I see these issues of racial equity to be similar. Right now, I'm on the policy side mostly, so I don't really look at the legal side anymore. I probably should be. I realized that this summer. And so I'm pushing out most of these policy recommendations for my office that are all race-based. Every single last one of them. They are a socially disadvantaged farmer is race-based category. And so everything that I'm sending out has race involved in it. And it is getting shot down like nobody's business because of what is going on the legal side of things. The Supreme Court getting rid of affirmative action in higher education. The issue with the Fearless Fund this summer, the grant program that was designed for Black women that is now gone, and they, in their argument, they used a constitutional amendment that was created after the Civil War for people who have been formerly enslaved. And so now we have people who are out here taking away things that are designed to make things more equitable for people of different racial backgrounds by using an amendment that was created to make things more equitable for people of different racial backgrounds. And there's a lot more, within that, obviously, the way in which they did it, what the amendment actually means. But that is the battleground that we're up against. And so I see so much of a separation between those two categories. We got the executive office, and they do this, and then Congress, they do this, and then, Supreme Court, they do this. But if we come together and kind of design these campaigns to really defeat all of these things, so like I'm creating policy recommendations and I'm engaging with law schools, which my office does, and I'm engaging with law schools and law students, then they are able to then look at what I've put together already, the research that's been done by my office, the data, and the recommendation that I'm putting forth, and they're able to say, oh no girl, this ain't going nowhere. Because of X, Y, and Z. Because, I'm only one person. I'm an attorney, but I'm not looking at the legal side of things all the time when I'm, creating policy, because those are oftentimes separate things. So I think that as we move forward in doing race-based advocacy, especially when we're engaging in the political side of race-based advocacy, we have to also include and lean on those who have legal expertise in doing those things.
So well put, and April, I want to point to, you said something when we met earlier this summer that I thought was so brilliant about this, which is that the way we got to this moment in this situation is that this is what the right did, right? They tried it in the legislature, it didn't work, then they would go to executive orders, and when that didn't work, they would go to the courts. And so we have to borrow that tool, and I thought that, and that's stuck with me ever since. Dãnia, I'm going to go to you next, because David got us started on this topic, and then I'll spin back to see if David has some final words on it.
Yeah, I think about the intersection between the passion that's around the environmental justice issue and the agricultural issue, and how that is helping young people see movements around the world. I think that we've missed the plot on the COVID pandemic, because my takeaway as a single mom that was in a house homeschooling and working full-time homeschooling a very active child was just how interconnected and interdependent we are as humans. And I go on social media a lot more than I should, and I will see someone in some other place on the other side of the world, and their sense of humor is exactly like mine. And I've just been like, are we all just living the same experience in like different, like we're all just human beings, right? Having this like spiritual experience in physical forms that look differently. But at our core, the ways in which we are similar is so much more prominent to me post-COVID. Our humanity is so much more prominent, and I have the benefit of being biracial, and my family looks like what America looks like. And so I've gotten to grow up as a new American and see the realization of what my family was sold 40 years ago as the American dream. And then for my child, I'm looking at that, and my child is questioning, will this environment support me being able to live to the same age that you are right now? So the question around the environment is a question of the youth of today around the world. And so seeing the ways in which young people are looking at questions around identity, I think that is the level of imagining the future world that it's going to take, And I'm actually heartened and excited by the reality that we saw that our government can respond to our human needs very quickly. You know, we had nutrition programs we'd never heard of before. And some states like Vermont now have made that the state law where children don't have to starve. Imagine that in the United States of America. Now children don't have to starve. And so we have that creativity within us. And even the Farm Bill is an example of that. When farmers and their families were struggling to provide for themselves, our government is powerful and strong enough. Why? Because we are strong enough, and our connections and our relationships with one another are strong enough to imagine what would a conservation title being pulled out of the Farm Bill for the first time ever and put in the Inflation Reduction Act, and then having a whole government approach to Justice 40, measuring disparities between and amongst communities, and appropriating and allocating resources accordingly. What if we just let our interconnectedness speak for itself? And so I think the environment and the Farm Bill are a really good backdrop against which our young folks and some of our legislators are looking towards the future. And then I also think the question of race. The United States has been very reticent to address that question, and I'm really not sure why that is. You know, in Jamaica we say out of many, one people, and that's really the reality that we're living, is that this call back to America and of America Old. America of America Old really was thinking about serving the people. And guess what? We're the people, right? And that's why we're all here, is that we all have this vision of what the future looks like that we're creating. And so I've been looking at Afrofuturist novelists and the ways in which I had never thought about, like, what if racism doesn't exist? I've always, as a lawyer and an advocate, I came into this work looking at maternal mortality disparities, and I was like, what are all the supports we could put around Black women so that they don't die during childbirth? And then here I was, a lawyer who almost died during childbirth. And then that came home. It really came home to me that the institutions are going to impact the individual, and our lived reality is something that cannot be pared down and taken away. And so we're really going to have to just sink our teeth in to that discomfort of looking each other in the eye and talking about the ways in which we have made whiteness a property right, and the laws have grown up around, and exactly what April was saying, all of the protections around our civil rights are being made fun of right now by folks saying cis-het white folks are the most oppressed people in this nation, and truly believing it so much that they're willing to murder other people for it. And so the convictions are deep, they're not light, and as a parent I think about our gun policies and the ways in which we export weapons around the world, and that is coming home to roost. And so if we can address this othering, the ways in which we use agricultural resources to other and exclude other folks, we can solve that here together.
Okay. David, you want to follow up on that?
Sure, I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds of policy development. Earlier I said that I don't think we have enough power as an ecosystem of progressive food and agriculture policy advocates. What do I mean by that? I mean that I think we have limited capacity and limited power, and I think that leads to limited attention and time to the work, and that leads to a limited scope of the work and of policy solutions, which also leads to a limited ability to mobilize, and a limited number of policy tools that we have available to us, that we have developed, that we understand, to use to accomplish those goals that we share. And I think all of this is summed up well by something, Sara, that you said in one of the previous sessions about triaging instead of movement building, right? Like, to work in policy is to triage, right? And put out fires, and you're constantly responding to whatever's happening in the moment, and it makes it hard to do the movement building change work that is so necessary. And so, I really think that we need to invest in, and I think we're doing this. We're moving in this direction. I think this panel is evidence that we're moving in this direction. The transformative farm bill work that UCS, Union of Concerned Scientists, is leading, like, that is evidence that we are headed in this direction. We're making progress, and we need to lean into that. You know, I think there are so many big issues to solve, right? If you look at the transformative farm bill letter, there's many marker bills there, and you won't find many of them in the base text that the House released, or, and you know, few in what Senator Stabenow released. And part of the reason for that is because we haven't been able to do the deep work of moving from idea to ledge text in a way that will produce ledge text that withstands the pressures of the legislative process and that withstands the legal challenges that inevitably come after when you're trying to do something new, trying to do something creative, trying to do something that's responding to what people are experiencing in a fresh way, in a really accountable way, in an inclusive way. You know, if you're trying to do that work, you need to bring the resources and time to bear that it requires. And I think we're struggling to do that. We're trying to do that. We're moving in that direction. But I think that is what is required to get to where we want to be. And I guess I'll just add one other thing on definitions of on policy language that talks about race explicitly, right? Like, this is a policy tool that we need to work on, and that requires a lot of discussion, a lot of careful planning and thinking, and the work of legal scholars and the work of policy minds and advocates and farmers and everybody who's impacted, right? We have two different definitions of socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher in the underlying statute that supports the Farm Bill. That's unhelpful, right, to have two different versions of that, right? One that includes gender, one that doesn't. And it's just as an example of something that deserves, you know, a really intensive bit of work to sort of ask the question of, okay, we've reached a moment where in our public discourse, this isn't working anymore because people are willing to go to the courts and try and tear it down and try and stop these things from having the outcomes that we had envisioned, right? And so we need to figure out new ways to get the racial equity outcomes from policy that we really want to see. And to do that work, you know, we need to work together.
Can I piggyback?
Yes. I knew it. I was like, and here we go.
You get that in perfectly.
I knew that this was where David might go, and I knew that you guys would want to chime in. So we're going to take a little break from the third question. We may not actually get to the third question fully, but let's open the conversation. Dãnia and April, do you want to rock, paper, scissors? Who's going to go first here?
You can go first.
Go, April.
Because you're probably going to take it. You're going to take it. You're going to take it there.
Okay, no, you go first, and then we'll let Dãnia go next.
So, I will start by saying I have a podcast to send to both of y'all when we finish here tonight. The definition issue, that has been a big issue for us at the Policy Center. That is one of the big things that we've been tackling, especially when it comes to access to capital and access to credit for specifically for farmers of color, but Black farmers in particular. So you're right, there are two definitions. One is through the Farm Service Agency, and the other one is in our two different farm bills, basically. And so the one that is gender specific, if you look and you're doing research on that, on, you know, who's getting access to programs, who's getting access to the things that they need, how are these farmers doing, do we need a socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher category anymore? If you look at it, and it's the one that includes gender, it says that socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers are doing really good. We might not even need the programs anymore. They're doing great. And then when you actually dig down in the weeds and you actually look at the data, it's white women. Mm-hmm. While other groups of socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers are continuing to decline because they don't have access to land, they're losing their land, they don't have access to credit, therefore they can't fund their operations, and so they don't have access to capital anymore. We actually did a study last year on where Black farmers are, how they're funding their operations. And I'll tell you right now, it's out of pocket. And so so that's why the definition is so important in which one you're looking at and which one you're using, because if you use the wrong one, you may think that a population of people is doing really good and they don't need any help. And there is a population of people who are, I think they're doing pretty good. They got good operations, but they're not getting access to the resources that they should have access to. And it is based on historic discrimination that is still lingering, that they are still recovering from, which is why we, especially when we talk about equity versus equality, that's why it's equity versus equality, because we're trying to help people play catch up to stuff they should have already had. But that's all I have on that definition thing. Definitions are a wild beast when it comes to policy.
So I'm going to take a quick time out here because I know this is going to be a great conversation, and I thought it might come up. And it is a hot topic for those of you who are not Farm Bill folk, and I'm just going to take a step back for those of you who, like me, knew nothing about this until the first time I sat down and took notes at the Farm Bill Summit. Let me explain something to you all who have not had time to read our Farm Bill Toolkit. So historically, the way that the Farm Bill worked and most farm allocations worked is that there was very little funding, there were very few programs, there were very little opportunities available or resources for farmers of color in the United States. This goes all the way back to, we could really talk about it really starting with 40 acres and a mule, right? We could talk about the history and ways in which, resources were given out, programs were given access, the ways we can talk about how they were constructed to really exclude farmers of color from having access, immigrant farmers, black farmers in particular, reservation-based farmers, etc. And this is why, though, Sakina is not here, sorry Sakina, why for many years folks have talked about, the USDA as the last plantation. And so what we see with the language of the socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher, for those of you who don't know, is that came out of years and years, Rhett's not here either, but years and years of conversation and strategizing to figure out how a category could be created to enable black and other farmers of color to have access to resources. So what they're talking about here are the ways, what our amazing scholars and experts and advocates are talking about here are the ways in which in recent years this category has operated in the same way that all of these kinds of post-1965-70 categories operate, where first it got expanded to really include white women in ways that shifted the focus, and now it is profoundly and deeply under attack in the ways that April was saying for being a violation of the 14th Amendment and all these other kinds of and all these other kinds of aspects. So what we're really seeing up here is a conversation about a lot of what April was already saying. How do we move forward when across these different branches of government, the capacity to do this kind of work around racial justice in the Farm Bill is becoming increasingly constrained on the level of the judicial branch and also on the level of grassroots organizing, this idea that don't these farmers already have enough? Right? So these are the questions. Where do you move forward? What are the coalitions we build? And what you're seeing out here playing out is a debate about whether the need is to create alternative policies that are colorblind in their language, but that create racial impact, versus whether there's a kind of project that needs to be done to re-articulate the language of racial exclusion, marginalization, and deprivation through these policies. So I'm just saying that because I suspect that some of you are like, what the hell just happened? Now all of a sudden we're debating this kind of definition, what's happening? Everyone's jumping out of their chair about 4 words. So started it. Farmers and ranchers. So I'm going to go to Dãnia now because I wanted you to know this is, and I wanted to contextualize this also for you all because this is also when we talk about how these things cross issues. We could be having a panel right now about education. We could be having a panel right now about reproductive politics. We could be having a panel right now about incarceration. And this same question of how do we create racial justice and equity in a moment where there's a national backlash against acknowledging disproportionate outcomes and impact. That is the conversation we'd be having in any of these spaces. Dãnia.
I was actually going to go somewhere completely different with my response, actually because I was thinking a lot about folks that aren't in the spaces having these conversations on a regular basis. And I want to go all the way back in US history, before we even had a constitution. And I want to go all the way back before we even had a definition of race and what race was. And I want to go back to the first folks that came from Europe to this continent. And I want you to think about the fact that those folks that arrived here had no capacity to tend the land. They had no capacity to understand the ecology. They had never owned land where they were coming from. They were landless peasants. And so there's an anxiety in the United States around time, and it's a colonial construct. And I've been very resistant to it of late because I think that in particular white Americans bear this out, this burden out of what it means to not have enough. Because in Jamaica we have this saying, enough is as good as a feast. And I feel like within white culture, there's this sense that I have to amalgamate and preserve. Because my ancestors, epigenealogy is real, epigenetics is a real thing. And we often look at it from the perspective of those who've been racialized, but we don't look at it from the perspective of why white supremacy matters. And why white supremacy feels so unspeakable and so resistant. And it's because white supremacy is a reaction to being in a country where everyone looks like you, and yet you own nothing. You don't even own your labor. You've probably come here because of some kind of debt-related situation. And so we have to humanize the reality of why people are so violent about not naming white supremacy. Because it's genetically an issue that has never been discussed openly. And so that's a challenge that I always put out to my white folks in the audience, because that is something that when we're talking about racism and definitions only came into existence as a way of masking and covering up the ways in which our first ruling by our Supreme Court around land was that, yeah, it belongs to those natives, but like, we're building a new country, so F them, summarizing. And so we have a constitution that when it was drafted, my ancestors were defined as physical property, right? And then I'm half Chinese. We have xenophobia in this country that is putting tariffs on products so that small farmers here in the US can no longer get a living because the seeds that they're having to procure are pricing them out of what they can get at market to recover for their inputs. And so I really want us, when we're thinking about policy, we cannot dehumanize the reality that all of our legislation, all of our policy is built on the human lack feeling that white supremacy propagates everywhere. And if we look at Brexit, there's so many folks who are now saying, we wish we never voted for Brexit. We were so focused on excluding people of color. We didn't realize we were going to go back to our landless serf status as white folks. And there are white folks in America who have that experience of living in intergenerational poverty. And that is a reality that we don't discuss, and that's why it's important. I appreciate David for being even on a panel where it could go left, right? It could very easily go left. And we have to be prepared as people in this space, and this is my challenge to you all, to be comfortable, to be the person to name the thing. Because the reason that definition, it comes from the Small Business Administration, from government contracts. And so it's really not even from agricultural policy. And then affirmative action, similarly. These policies were brought over into agricultural policy, but white women have been used to throw the plot off the track, right? So when we've talked about equity, a lot of it has been, okay, let's throw women in. Okay, what are we gonna throw walruses in next? Like the ways in which the language and policy becomes like, oh, we just have this little time. we have this little time to build trusting relationships with each other because we're creating a new world. We're in Jamaica right now, it's only a 60-plus-year-old country. They're writing a new constitution. That's a possible reality that we have. Folks say we can't start over with a new farm bill. They started a new farm bill in 1930, right? So like these things that have happened historically in this very country, in our very ancestry, we have all of the benefit of, there's some native folks who say that the past isn't behind you, it's in front of you, because that's everything you can see. We can see the evidence of where history has brought us. And so now what we have to do is create a new imagination together. And that's what our legacy will be. We don't have to look back hundreds of years to say entrenched racism, entrenched classism, entrenched sexism. We feel it in our bodies, it comes out of our pores. What is the gift we're going to give to our descendants when America is on the judgment block for how it dealt with race? And that is a challenge, and I'm putting it to you because I know that we can do it. I believe in us wholeheartedly. This is why I do the work that I do. I very much believe in America, and I believe we're powerful beyond our imaginations, especially those of us who want to talk about the ways in which we can write a new future.
So in case any of you want to know what the last question was that we were going to talk about, that this is better than that. My question was not this good. So I'm going to throw it to David here, and then I'm going to ask for last thoughts from our panelists, like last things.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, I want to. I appreciate so much where you took that, and then bringing it back to where we are now, and that fragility that you were talking about, and that scarcity, that individualism and scarcity. These are things that come with white supremacy as well, and you saw that play out in the policy context, in the context of very specific legislative language with the American Recovery Plan Act, right, toward the end in the pandemic. Language in that bill that was intended to start, right, righting some of these wrongs, right, had to be redrafted to be less specific about race in order to actually have an impact, because it was tied up in the courts. And so the Inflation Reduction Act, which came around in, I think it was June of 2022, fixed that language, made it less race specific, and then money was able to flow, right? And one of the programs that came from that was the Discrimination Financial Assistance Program. I think about $2 billion has gone out the door now, and it's not perfect, right? It could have been better, but the language, the legal language that came out of Congress bound it in certain ways, right? And so if you had a relative, right, who had experienced discrimination, that wasn't part of this, right? Or if you experienced discrimination after 2001, January 2001, that wasn't part of this. And so these bright lines, whether it is a definition of socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher, or it's a farm income, what's on your tax return, if it's gender, age, whatever it is, when you create these bright lines in legal language, there's going to be people who are in and who are out, right? And you can't avoid that. If you put a bright line, no matter what it ties to, there's going to be people who are in and who are out. And so I think we have an opportunity to think, how do we achieve the outcomes we want to achieve without putting these bright lines in place? Because inevitably someone's going to look at that and say, the door is shut to me, and that is not cool, and because of all the context that Dãnia just outlined, right, that takes the form of violent and very aggressive sort of responses and racist responses, and we have to work around that. I believe that we should be, and if you had listened to me in 2019, 2020, I would have talked about race-specific language and the need to go there in a very intentional way. And because of what we've seen happen through 2022, 2023, I no longer believe that we're ready for that, right? We got to figure out a different way, because that's become a third rail. You put that in a proposed policy language, it's not going anywhere. And that is a sad state of affairs, because shines a light on our inability to have the real conversation, the full conversation about race, about social, economic policy and everything that it connects to. But we're not ready for that as a country, and that's become very clear. And so we have to figure out a different way to get there.
So on that final thoughts, right? I mean, this is, I think, I will just say as we move forward this year with our program, but also as we move forward this year and trying to figure out what we want to do in terms of agricultural policy, this is precisely the question, is how do we get to this place that Dãnia is pointing, this, and like, what would it actually mean, as David started us with the idea of a just farm future, right? What would that look like? And how do we get there in the wake of this kind of pushback? What individual responsibilities do we need to take? What communities and collectivities do we need to build? What new strategies do we need to try, right? Because all of these things might be necessary, because we can keep taking language out, but also, we also need to ask folks to take responsibility for what fears and closing down that language inspires in them, right? How do we do that work? Okay, last words from our three speakers. Do you feel done? Do you feel?
Oh, I thought you were going to tell us who the
No. I thought you were all jumping before I stopped.
We were just trying to get back in order.
You were,
We were trying to get back in
You're trying to
order.
pretend that this is an orderly panel, not the panel that it actually is. Okay, we're gonna have a.
We'll go this way.
I'll go.
Okay,
Yeah, I'll go.
Okay, we'll go.
I'll go.
Okay, wait,
Okay,
no,
This way.
Let her go.
I was just taking, I was
We're
just
gonna
being a
mix it
leader.
up. We're gonna go April, David, Dãnia.
Oh, okay, that's different. Okay, let me make sure this is actually on. So I think that I will end kind of the discussion that we've been having with something that I picked up on my daily doom scroll this morning. Y'all do it too. So, I'm scrolling through, it wasn't TikTok this time, it was Instagram. And I saw a post from this organization called Hip Politics, but they reposted from Hip Hop Caucus. And it said, just because you don't do politics doesn't mean politics isn't gonna do you. And I was like, yes, because I have friends, lawyer friends from all over, and their favorite thing that they say to me is, I don't do politics. And my response to them is, well, I'm looking at them, they're looking at me, I'm like, well, politics is gonna do you, and so I was like, you took the words right out of my mouth. And that, I think, especially with the culmination of this panel, is one of the biggest things that I want to leave you with, especially with the conversation about community, is engaging those around you in the political process and what is going on politically and legally. Because again, I say, just because you don't do politics, or I don't like it, I don't understand it, I don't understand everything either. But I have an understanding that as a Black woman in America, the politics are most definitely going to come for me at some point, already are. I'm in Mississippi, so it's happening on a regular basis. And so I want to really leave you with, especially as we talk about agriculture, like I said earlier, very traditional, very conservative. Don't exit the conversation just because you don't do politics or you don't have an understanding of the political process. Bring other people in that you don't feel like have a full understanding. I work a lot with farmers who have no political background. I start all of my conversation off with, who knows what the Farm Bill is? And I'm like, that's okay. I didn't know what it was 4 years either. And then we talk about what the Farm Bill is and what the process of getting one is. People don't know. People don't know how Congress works. People don't know how things make it up to the Supreme Court. People don't know, the difference between their state government, their local government, and the federal government. And so that is what I want to leave you with today, is that a part of you working in community and advocating for others is making sure that you take this understanding and education that you've been able to gain as a law student or as a college student, somebody who's been able to come into this room. There are people who haven't been able to come in this room. They have no idea that this event is going on tonight. That you take that and you engage them in the things that are going to affect them, so that they can advocate for themselves and then go on to advocate for others. And so I will leave it at that and pass it off to David.
I love that. If you don't do politics, politics will do you. I think you could say the same about policy. Right? I've heard so many people say to me, "Oh, I'm not a policy person," right? And I push back on that every time I hear it, because you don't have to get paid to work on policy, to be the policy person, right? Like, reading the, if you can read an instruction manual, you can read policy, right? Like, it's just the rules to the game. And we make it hard. It doesn't have to be hard, right? And I think engaging with policy is really critical. I think because if you don't, right, if you don't make yourself heard, then policies will not necessarily serve you. And I think I think we as a country have lost sight a little bit of like what actually is for the public good and what is for someone's bottom line, right? And I think we need to have that discussion as well, because a lot of policies that I see, I don't see the connection to the public good. I see a connection to someone's bottom line. And so as we look to the future, I think that is what, sitting in that tension and discomfort of how do we craft policies that everybody can see themselves in and that actually do serve the public good in a responsible way. Good governance is something that's about accountability and responsibility and proactiveness and forethought, and I think we really need to lean into that.
Absolutely. Okay. Last word?
So the farmers taught me everything that I know about the Farm Bill and about policy advocacy. Ben Burkett in particular, the GOAT, reads the Farm Bill. He is a farmer who I have been out to his farm in Petal, Mississippi, and it's very hot. And this 80-year-old man is jumping up and down off of a truck trying to plant watermelons, and he flies up to DC however many times a year as he's able to sit down with his electeds wherever he can, at their state office or up here, to explain to them how those policies affect him as he works his land. And so, I think that one opportunity that young folks have that have so many things vying for their attention, and I've heard this thing about like too many things to make one choice, you have a calling that is on you to fulfill, that in the grand scheme may seem inconsequential or insignificant, and you might have been discouraged, or you might discourage yourself from pursuing that thing. But I hope one thing that you've learned is that there's so many paths to achieving that calling that you've been placed here to do. And along that way, if you're really tuned in to your specific calling, I call it in my lane. So like when I'm really in my lane, like I'm really not thinking about how fast April or David are running, because it's Dãnia versus Dãnia, right? It's like, I just want to be better than the last time I ran that same 100 meters, right? And I think that that's a very exciting thing for young people at the start of your careers, to think that your task is to really think about what are all the skills, all of the experiences that you've had in your lived experience that allows you to sit down with your elected official and speak to them as another person and really explain to them that issue. Because if you can sit here and listen to ag policy debates amongst experts for an hour, you can sit down with people in your family. You can sit down with neighbors. I talk to people in the grocery line, on airplanes, at the airport, about Farm Bill. And my trick is I wear sparkly shoes. So an elder will always come up to me and ask me about why I'm wearing sparkly shoes, and then I'll engage them. I was at Marshall's, and a woman engaged me in a conversation about ag policy in the U.S. And so I want, and that's because I was buying cowboy-related attire, yes, because I'm going to Farm Aid this week. But I think that you all have to, it's really a challenge that David put out when he said about power. Because what us lobby want policy folks, we don't have the juice when we go and we say it's really important to the American public that there be racial equity in the Farm Bill. and then you all are talking about TikTok bans. Like, if our movements are so disjointed and fragmented because folks feel like they're spread too thin across too many issues, and they're not really able to make those interconnections, then those calls are not going to be going up to the senators to really amplify and sustain that piece of legislation across the finish line. Sometimes my policy gets there just because I'm willing to hang in there and be that nerd for as long as it takes. And it's like, those are the things that if you have a dream, if you have a vision, I tell this to my kiddo, anything you practice, you'll become really good at. And if you practice making excuses, you'll become really good at making excuses. And so don't fall for that trap of there's polycrises, because it's really just one crisis. It's a question of corporate consolidation and humanity. And so there's definitely more of us than there are corporations. But if when we start earning income, we become those shareholders that are like, burn down the Amazon so that I can get, my returns because I want to retire and have a yacht. If we grow up to become those people, then we've already voted with the actions that we choose to do. So you are the only one that can do what you can do, but together, that's how we bring our country along, to have this conversation, these necessary conversations, so that we can have legislation that really reflects, so that I don't have an Uber driver that's never heard of the Farm Bill ever again, because he's already had a student like you all who's already mentioned to them that they're going to this talk about the Farm Bill, right? Like, it really can be a casual conversation. We really can build connection wherever we want to go. We can really achieve everything that we want to. We are limitless. And so let's be limitless together.
To throw it out for questions. We are over time. I fully recognize that. But I also really want us to have room for questions. If you are sitting in a seat, you may have a mic in front of, no, you don't have mics in front of you. Those are fake. They're not turned on. That is your mic over there. And you got to speak up when you get to, oh, yes, maybe. Yes? Yes. Come on over.
Can I just speak loudly, or do I
No.
have to speak just
I can bring you the mic, or you can get the mic, but no, not because we want to embarrass you, because we have folks online who can't hear when you speak loudly.
Thank you.
Yeah, you just have to talk a little loudly.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for coming today. My name is Sara. I'm a first-year master's student studying global environmental policy, and I'm here with Garrett's class. I was wondering, and you can answer this from the perspective of a collective organizing perspective or just your own personal perspectives, when do you make the choice of choosing to dismantle a system versus choosing to expand access to that system? And I'm specifically thinking about, I think it's called the Heirs Property Act. That's one of the things that I read about in the toolkit. And I know that there's been a lot of collective organizing around educating farmers about, getting their wills in, making sure they have a will in so that their property later when they pass away is not divided. Wouldn't it just be better to just change that law in the first place? But I don't know, it's a little bit harder. Thank you.
So as the heirs property nerd on the
You did the heirs property.
So, yeah, good call out. I did not plant that question. That's a fantastic question, and I think that it's something that we all have to weigh, right? Like, because you asked for a line in the sand, I'm going to give you the lawyer answer. It depends, right? Like, and with regard to the heirs property in particular, heirs property is a product of state law. So each individual state would have to change their individual state laws to address the ways in which heirs inherit and make decisions about their property. The Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act and some of the heirs property legislation that has been pulled into the Farm Bill or attempts to try to make nationwide policies that would be available to states that had gotten on board. I think there are about 23 states now that have passed the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. But for those folks who live in states that have not passed that legislation, they don't have access to those federal resources. And so when we're talking about heirs property, it's the result of someone who owns property and passes away without an estate plan, without a will, without any trusts. And that's something that is not uniquely an African American experience, but it has been studied because a lot of African Americans in the South and their family members who live all over the country have inherited heirs property. And so the intestacy issue is not an issue that can be resolved by one piece of policy. It would take each state addressing it separately. And so that is the question that I would put to you is like, depending on the state that you're in, what would the appetite be for having a complete reform? Because what the UPHPA actually just gives us a definition and gives some legal protections to heirs in a specific lawsuit called a partition action. It doesn't actually protect them against losing their property by a lot of the ways, and it's very relevant right now because a lot of the false solutions to climate change exploit heirs property landowners because they know it's really, really easy to dispossess them of their property by buying the legal intestacy right of an individual heir. So if we want to think about the entire group of folks who are heirs property owners, we would have to get enough folks to address it in all of the states. And there's been a lot of success with the UPHPA, but it hasn't been universal yet. And so that's very much a reality of the questions that we as advocates ask ourselves as well. And individual estate plans cannot address institutional problems. And these institutions are governed by state law, and that's why it's so entrenched.
Okay, how about black sweater? Oh, yeah, I'll let you decide. I hope I'm
Hi, I just want to say, first of all, I've been following your work for a while, so it's super exciting to listen to the talk. I wanted to go back to an early point that you mentioned about sort of like the impacts that we have, like transporting food leads to sort of like globally people would lose jobs because of just how like the global economic change works. And then I want to go back to your point of interconnectedness. And in the US, so much of farm labor is coming from outside, and so that goes into that question of like how US ag policy globally affects this change and how that is all interconnected, and then thinking about whiteness as property and how that sort of plays out. How could we be more mindful of like the US ag, like when we're drafting the farm bill and policy here domestically, thinking a little bit globally, because there's such like that cyclical effect of that. I myself was studying the Indian farmers movement, and in that I think it came up a lot of how the WTO policies when I was talking to the farmers, they're very cognizant of the fact how American policy is affecting Indian farmers. They know more than, so I'm just wondering if you had how.
So let's actually take both questions at once, and then we'll answer both questions.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
You just have to be a little louder if you don't have laryngitis.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm just so fortunate to be in this room, in this space with everyone, and hear everything you had to say. I love the talk about coalition building and making connections. At the same time, though, there's always a feeling comes up whenever I hear bipartisan, because that I always hear the compromises that are being done are people who are always in sacrifice zones, for example, who are the communities that are always going to be placed near hazardous facilities, who are the people who are always left behind. And it's words such as the not color specific or the not racial, racialized language that allows for state rights to be used as ways to leave people behind or not only neglect but actively harm people. So I would love to hear more about the difference between coalition building and making sure that everyone is included and maybe, and trying to combat the compromising by trying to move something more national forward.
Okay, how do you want to do it? Do you want to? Yeah, why
Oh,
don't we
okay.
get?
I can, were you speaking were you asking directly to me? Because it looked like you were.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was like, I feel like that was a call-out question. Yes, so, awesome work that you're doing, by the way. I think that what we saw coming out of the pandemic was that the consolidation of our meat processing facilities, the ways in which, you know, you can get watermelon in December anywhere in the country. Our distribution channels are so globalized that obviously fossil fuels play a significant role in agricultural production and distribution. And when you're talking about World Food for Peace, for example, there have been times when the policy has been, instead of sending commodities abroad, we'll just send cash because it's cheaper and there's like less of an ecological impact. And so when we're even asking the question from the perspective of, is this edifying the environment? I think that's a really good framing of the question around building the solidarity that we have, because the environment of any individual farmer is not wholly separate than the neighboring farmer. And in the same way, the environmental impact of the US is felt by Latin America and the Caribbean. So the environment is a really good framework for thinking of the ways in which the impacts of the exploitation of natural resources and the degradation of our environment really shows that the human impact is pretty much universal, right? So the global South and the US South have a lot of similar sacrifice zones because of a lot of the same economic policies that are made around transportation and distribution. And when farmers are able to have on-farm slaughter, on-farm processing, when cooperatives are given the capital that they can thrive so that groups of farmers can work together, then you can have a local food system that's actually responsive to local community demands. And we have opportunities to educate folks about why they have access to certain things because they live in Idaho. And is it really best policy for US farmers to be thinking about shipping their goods to a global market when they're folks that are in their community? You speak to the average farmer and ideally they would be producing for their local community, but it's about how will they get paid, right? And so I think when you think about it from the perspective of the farmers, I think farmers, because they're scientists, like magicians, you know, all of the things, they can really see how the impact of the environment affects them universally. So they're a very inspiring group for me globally to have that conversation. And it has to be small scale farmers that you're having that conversation with, because that, like I said, like it's the corporate consolidation that has happened that has exacerbated the environmental and ecological impacts, so much so that US small farmers, regardless of race, but race is a worsening, exacerbating factor, but regardless of race, there's a dramatic decline that's emerging amongst small-scale producers in this country who would want to be growing for their local communities. And so we really do have to think about the global impacts. How can we have ways in which we are being of benefit of good global citizens without putting it from the perspective of decimating other groups of people? And so if we think about the question from the perspective of the smallest producers, the largest ecological, having the largest ecological impact when you add them all up, as opposed to putting resources into the hands of the largest, most consolidated industries, which has happened in our recent history, because the worst polluters, give them a lot of money, they can clean up their act, instead of giving the investments to all of the small-scale producers. So those are very real questions, and you're framing it from the right perspective, and so keep doing what you're doing. And I think also that the coalition question is something that there's flux, and I'll leave it to David because that's a huge part of what Young Farmers does.
No, David, take a stab at it, and that's going to be our last answer. If you have more questions, you can talk to the panelists outside afterwards. We would keep this going forever, but there's a class in here at 8 p.m., so we can't, unfortunately. So David, take a stab. I wanted to talk about coalition. Let's talk about coalition.
Yeah, I love the question because we are presented with trade-offs so often in life, especially in this country as a zero-sum game. It's either this or it's that, right? It's either bipartisan or it's not going anywhere. And I think when I think about coalition building, I think about building coalition at the front end, right? And this is why I was talking earlier about why the capacity we have as an ecosystem to do this work is so important, because to get this right, to do this coalition building work in a way that facilitates the big changes we need to see, right? It takes time, it takes a long time, it takes a lot of resources. And so I think on the front end, you need to think about building coalitions with people who are already aligned.
Yes.
Right? You have a shared vision, right? Like when we talk in our strategic plan at Young Farmers Coalition about a more just future for agriculture, and I think there are many actors in this work who have that shared vision, right? And so let's get together and dream up the best possible policy that we can, right? And then let's start working that through the process. Let's worry about feasibility later. The problem with that approach is that we often don't have the luxury of time that it takes to do that right. And so when you're in a situation where you need to come up with your farm bill platform and you've only got a few months, and then the ship is going to be sailed, the cake is baked, whatever, right? Like there's all this pressure, and you have to produce something, and you have to have it have tangible outcomes, and so you're meeting that feasibility piece like at the start, and that's not great. Right? Like if you're trying to get to that dream, that big dream, right? And so I think you don't have to choose, is the point I'm trying to say, but you have to think about what you can accomplish today, this week, this year, and be real about it, right? Like we need to also be honest with each other when we're talking about the opportunities at hand. We need to be honest about how hard things are and about what's really possible and what's not. And instead of, no, we can't do that, so we can do that, but it's going to take 5 or 10 years, And so I would approach things from that, and I would just say too, like, at Young Farmers we talk about an irrefutable voice, right? Being able to take a recommendation to Congress and have so much support behind it that it is irrefutable, regardless of your politics, right? To get to that place, is going to take a lot of work, but I think it's important because. We have to be better prepared than those who would, we have to be better prepared than those who see policy as a zero-sum game, right, if we're gonna make progress.
I love that as a place to end. Yeah, that's exactly it. So I'm going to actually, first I'm going to make very short closing remarks. I first of all want to thank our incredible panel here tonight, and to say that this is just one part of a long conversation that's already been happening among these organizations, happening with folks like the Union of Concerned Scientists, Transformative Farm Bill, like a bunch of different organizations that are available. You can find them at the back of the toolkit. You can find them often listed on each other's websites, but our hope is that soon you will be able to find them on our website, farmbillfairness.org, where in addition to our Fire Right Now Farm Bill recordings, our digital archives of the Spring 2023 Summit, you'll also find a list of organizations and resources, and a new series of over 30 interviews with members of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, a hub that we're going to be growing over time, with the goal being that we can have some places that help bridge that gap between what can we do right now and what are the conversations and connections that we need to build to connect grassroots organizations and scholars working on agricultural policy, racial justice, and climate justice with policy advocates and lobbyists, so that we can have some of that irrefutable voice before we get to the next moment when the legislation is hitting the fan, for lack of a better term. But Thank you all so much for this. Thank you for our speakers, to peel, to pack. Thanks to all of you in the room. My last request, please make sure that you clean up after yourselves, because we do have a, not just because, you know, cleaning up is nice, but also because we have a class in here at 8 o'clock and we want everybody to be clean for peel. And for our next Fire Right Now on Race in the Elections on October 23rd, be sure to tune in either in person, on Instagram, or on YouTube. Thank you all so much.